The story I am about to tell is about the most bitter moment of my life when betrayal did not come from strangers, but from the very people I loved most. Right in the middle of my daughter's lavish wedding, her soon-to-be husband coldly demanded that I hand over $50,000 to remain in their lives while my daughter stood silently in agreement. In that moment, I realized that my motherhood had been weighed and measured, and I had to decide, keep enduring it or stand up to protect my own dignity. Before we dive into her story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Hearing from people around the world makes these stories even more powerful and reminds us how connected we all are. I have been through many storms in my life, but nothing prepared me for the one that began under the soft pink skies of Charleston that evening. The air smelled of salt and gardenias, the kind of scent you'd think would belong to a perfect summer wedding. Fairy lights were strung from palm to palm, and the waves rolled in just far enough to make a steady, soothing hush behind the jazz band's gentle swing. From the outside, it was flawless, the kind of event you'd see in a glossy bridal magazine, all champagne flutes and carefully curated smiles. But I knew something was coming. I just didn't know how sharp it would cut. Sophie was radiant in her gown, the silk catching every thread of sunset like it had been spun from the light itself. My only daughter, my only child. I'd carried her through nights when I thought the weight of the world would break me, worked shifts until my hands cracked so she could have the life she dreamed of. And now here she was, standing in the glow of a dream I thought we'd built together. That's when Ethan, tall, immaculately dressed, and as polished as the cufflinks glinting on his sleeves, stepped closer to me. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. $50,000, he said casually, as though he were discussing the weather. For the privilege of staying in our lives. I blinked, certain I'd misheard him. The music still floated around us. The smell of rosemary from the cocktail bar hung in the air, but his words had a weight that pressed against my chest. Before I could speak, Sophie joined him, her champagne flute poised delicately between two fingers. Or, she added, her voice as calm as if she were reading a menu. You could choose the peace and quiet of a retirement home. Your choice, Mom. My choice. They stood there together, two perfectly posed figures in their wedding finery, confident, untouchable. In their minds, I was small enough to be moved off the board with a single conversation. I smiled. Not because I agreed, not because I was afraid, but because this was the moment I had been waiting for. You've forgotten one thing, I said quietly. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't panic, not yet, but it was enough. A thin hairline crack in their flawless facade. The wind off the water caught the edge of my shawl, lifting it like a banner. And for a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. There was something in the certainty of my tone that made them both shift, just slightly, as if they'd felt the ground tilt beneath their feet. They had no idea I'd been preparing for this for months. I didn't come to Charleston to be humiliated. I came knowing exactly who they had become and exactly who they thought I was. They believed I was weak because I lived alone, disposable because I no longer fit into their carefully curated image. They forgot that I had built my life from nothing once before, and that I could dismantle theirs without ever raising my voice. You've forgotten one thing, I repeated softly, letting the breeze carry my words toward the sea. Then I excused myself as politely as if I were stepping away to powder my nose. I didn't go to the ladies' room. Instead, I crossed the marble-tiled reception hall, past the glowing candles and the chatter of guests, and slipped out onto a narrow wooden walkway that wound between the sand dunes. Out there, away from the lights, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner. The sun was sinking fast, smearing gold across the waves, and I could almost hear my own heartbeat over the surf. I sat on an old bench that faced the ocean, the paint chipped, the wood rough against my palms. From here, the wedding looked like something in the distance, not a part of me anymore. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady. One text. That was all it would take. Sandcastle time, I typed. Within seconds, the reply came. Understood. Packages are being delivered now. Legal team is standing by. Are you okay? It was from Karen, my oldest friend, my quiet anchor through this storm. I stared at the horizon for a long moment before answering. I will be. That was the truth. For the first time in years, I felt certain of it. Sitting there, I let go of the last fragile hope that Sophie might choose love over image, truth over performance. My daughter had made her choice long before this night, and I had made mine. When I finally rose, brushing sand from my shoes, I walked back toward the reception, but not as a guest anymore. I walked as someone holding the real power in the room. The moment I stepped inside, I saw it beginning. The wedding coordinator, elegant and unruffled, moving from table to table, handing sealed envelopes to certain guests, the ones who, whether they knew it or not, had invested in Sophie's boutique under Ethan's guidance. Each envelope contained a formal notice, immediate audit, frozen accounts, and a detailed explanation of the unauthorized transfers that had been made. It didn't take long for the ripples to spread. And I simply watched. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. I could feel it happening in real time, the shift in the air, the murmurs sweeping through the crowd like a sudden change in the wind before a storm. One table after another, guests began leaning toward each other, whispering, brows furrowed as they unfolded the papers inside those ivory envelopes. Some reached for their phones immediately. Others stared across the reception at Sophie and Ethan as though they'd just realized they were standing on a sinking ship. I stayed near the edge of the patio, half hidden by a row of potted palms. From here, I could see the Harringtons, Ethan's parents, reading their own envelope. His father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. Without a word, he tossed his napkin onto his chair and strode across the floor, his wife trailing behind him, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the wood. At the far side of the room, Ethan was laughing with one of his groomsmen, or pretending to. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and I saw him glance down at the screen. The smile died instantly. He looked around, scanning the crowd, and then he saw his father. The two met halfway, and whatever Ethan tried to say was cut short by his father's low, furious voice. Sophie appeared a moment later, her veil catching the breeze, her champagne flute trembling just slightly in her hand. She scanned the crowd until her eyes landed on me. "Mom," she said, crossing the space between us in a rush, her voice tight. "What is going on? People are saying there's some kind of audit notice. Guests are getting these emails about the store. Everyone's looking at us like, it's not a rumor," I said, my voice steady. "It's exactly what it says. I'm exercising my rights as majority owner." For a moment, she just stared at me, as if the words were in another language. "What? No, Mom. You can't just—" "Yes," I said simply. "I can." Ethan appeared at her side, his perfect groom's composure cracking. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed, his words clipped, his teeth clenched. "I protected my investment," I replied. "Something you should have done before you started funneling store funds into your pet real estate project." His eyes flashed, and for the first time, he dropped the polished act. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, stepping closer. "My family looks about ready to disown you," I interrupted, tilting my head toward his father, who was now on the phone, pacing along the edge of the dance floor, his face a storm. "And frankly, I'm not interested in your threats. I've lived through worse than anything you could imagine." Sophie's voice broke in, higher, more desperate now. "Mom, please, everything we've worked for." I turned to her then, and for the first time all night, I let her see the hurt beneath my calm. "Everything we worked for? Sophie, you made sure to erase me from that story a long time ago." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. And in that silence, I remembered exactly when I'd first realized my daughter was willing to step over me to reach her dreams. It was 3 years ago, in Boston. The boutique had just started to find its footing. Sales were slow at first, and the bills were constant rent, utilities, supplies. I'd been covering gaps without a word, using my savings, even pawning a few pieces of jewelry I'd kept from my younger days. I didn't mind. That's what mothers do, I told myself. Then one afternoon, a young woman walked into the shop. She was petite, with a cascade of copper hair and a shy smile. She introduced herself as Marcy Hill, a local designer who worked with natural fabrics and hand-dyed linens. I could tell she was talented just from the pieces she carried in her tote bag. Sophie wasn't there that day, so I spent nearly an hour with Marcy, looking at her work, asking about her process. There was something fresh and authentic in her designs, the kind of thing that could set the boutique apart. I invited her to bring a small collection for Sophie to see. Within weeks, Sophie had not only agreed to carry Marcy's line, but she had built a whole display around it. And then something unexpected happened. A lifestyle influencer stumbled upon the boutique, tried on one of Marcy's dresses, and posted about it. The next morning, there was a line out the door. Business boomed after that. The boutique was suddenly on every local fashion blogger's radar, and Marcy's pieces were flying off the racks. But as the months passed, I noticed something changing. The social media posts stopped tagging Marcy. New designs were coming in from bigger, flashier brands. And then one day, Marcy showed up at my apartment, her eyes red from crying. Sophie had told her they were moving in a different direction, and that her line no longer fit the boutique's image. I confronted Sophie that night. She smiled, sipped her wine, and said, "Mom, you have to think bigger. Small-town artisans are sweet, but they won't get us to the next level. Us." But what she meant was her. Back at the wedding, Ethan was still talking, his voice low and sharp. "Do you realize how much damage you've just done?" I looked at him, unblinking. Yes, and it was necessary. Across the patio, Karen caught my eye. She gave the smallest nod, the kind that said it's all in motion now. I thought of the weeks we'd spent preparing, combing through contracts, tracing money transfers, compiling everything into a neat, unshakable case. I hadn't always been this calculated. Once, I'd been naive enough to believe that love and loyalty were enough to keep people honest. That was before Sophie's father. The night I left him is burned into my memory like a photograph I can't tear up. Rain hammering against the windows. Sophie, 4 years old, standing barefoot in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes too wide and too knowing for her age. I'd learned by then that bruises heal, but the silence that follows screaming can cut deeper than any word. That night, I packed a canvas tote with what I could carry a few of Sophie's favorite clothes, some snacks, our passports, and $237 I'd hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice. We left without looking back, took a bus to Dorchester, and slept on a friend's pull-out couch. 2 weeks later, I found us a one-room apartment that smelled of cabbage and cigarette smoke. It wasn't much, but it was ours. And no one yelled there. No one raised a hand. Sophie slept through the night for the first time in months. From then on, I worked every job I could get, mornings at a diner, evenings answering phones at a dental clinic, weekends stocking shelves at a department store. My body ached constantly, but Sophie was safe, and that was enough. At least, it used to be. Now, in the warm Charleston night, I felt the weight of all those years pressing against this single moment. Sophie's face was pale, her eyes darting between me and Ethan, between the guests who were starting to gather in small, tense clusters. "Mom," she said again, softer now, "we can fix this. Just release the accounts. We'll make it right." I shook my head. "You can't fix what you broke on purpose." Ethan stepped forward, but I turned away from him, focusing only on my daughter. "Sophie, you showed me exactly what I mean to you. I believe you." Somewhere behind us, the band was still playing, the saxophone weaving a slow, mournful tune. The fairy lights swayed gently in the ocean breeze, casting shifting shadows across the floor. It might have been beautiful if it weren't for the undercurrent of panic threading through every movement in the crowd. Karen approached then, holding her phone. "Linda," she said quietly, "the vendors have been notified. The board has the audit order. It's done." Ethan cursed under his breath. Sophie's hand trembled against her champagne glass. I took a step back, letting the space between us widen, letting the truth settle in. I wasn't their safety net anymore, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the least bit guilty about it. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. The first shout cut through the music like a snapped string. It came from the direction of the Harrington table, where Ethan's father was now flanked by 2 men in dark suits who had the stiff posture of people paid to carry bad news. His mother pinched the bridge of her nose, blinking back a mortified sheen that no amount of powder could fix. Around them, curiosity was turning into calculation. People who spent their lives at charity, luncheons, and board retreats knew the sound of a deal coming apart. They began drifting toward the exits, toward the valet stand, toward the edges where reputations might be salvaged if they left quickly enough. I stayed where the wind threaded through the palms and lifted the corners of the white tablecloths. It smelled of salt and lemon and the faint metallic tang of panic. Sophie tried to anchor the room with a smile. She took the microphone near the band and tapped it lightly, her voice rising with a glossy, hostess brightness I recognized from the days she practiced for local television segments. "Everyone, if you'll give us a moment, minor technical issues, that's all." She laughed, the sound hitting a register I had once heard when she was a little girl pretending to run a tea party. "Please enjoy dessert. There's key lime tartlets and—" "Enough," Ethan's father said, not loudly but with a gravity that pulled heads toward him. "This is not a technical issue." Ethan swallowed. I watched the play of instinct across his face, charm first, then indignation, then the quick mental inventory of who he could still control. He chose me. He closed the space between us in 3 long strides. "You think you can embarrass us?" he said, voice pitched for my ears alone. "You think this is clever? You are only hurting her." He flicked his eyes toward Sophie, a punctuation mark, a possession. "Hurting her," I repeated, as if trying on the shape of the words. There was no anger in my tone. Anger belonged to a different woman, a younger one who still thought raising her voice could change a man like Tom or a boy like Ethan. "Ethan, look around. I did not write the transfers. I did not move vendor payments to cover a land option your father told you not to touch. I did not coach you to call me a street vendor in a text." His jaw tensed. The cufflinks flashed again as he folded his arms. "You are used to rooms that forgive you," I said. "This one won't." Karen came to stand slightly behind my shoulder. She didn't need to speak. The folder in her hand was as eloquent as scripture. Reconciled statements, signature trails, board resolutions, the quiet architecture of consequences. Across the patio, a small cluster of guests looked at me, then at their envelopes, then at Sophie. The way people look at a painting once they realize the gentle landscape hides a battlefield. I caught the eye of a woman in a sea-glass dress, and recognized her a boutique owner from Savannah who had once asked me how to find artisans who made dresses that felt like something your grandmother would bless before Sunday. Service. I had sent her to Marcy. As if conjured by the thought, memory knocked not the ugly kind that drags you back through a door you swore you'd nailed shut, but the honest kind that insists on being seen so you can stop carrying it in your spine. It was the afternoon I found Marcy at the back of the boutique, gathering her remaining pieces into a garment bag. The light fell through the front windows in long bars. Sophie had just left for a meeting uptown. The air smelled like new tissue paper and disappointment. "She said the brand is moving in a cleaner direction," Marcy murmured, fingers worrying the strap of the bag. "Less handmade, more curated." "Curated," I said gently, feeling the word like a bruise under makeup. "She was kind," Marcy added quickly, as if she still owed gratitude for a door that was now closing. "Said she might keep the summer wraps." She tried to smile. "Just not the dresses, not the story." Not the story. That was the first time I truly understood what success had demanded of my daughter. Not simply money, but edits. A new script with no room for mothers or makers who did not flatter the brand. In the weeks after, I kept expecting Sophie to show up at my apartment with takeout and say, "I overreacted. We can make room. We can be big and still be kind." Instead, she brought me the latest magazine profile and a tote with the store logo and talked about scaling, about margins, about how sometimes you had to trim narrative clutter. She meant people. Now, on her wedding night, the narrative clutter had a microphone and a legal team. Sophie left the mic on the bandstand and came to me, slower this time. The gloss of the hostess' voice had cracked. "Mom," she said, "I was wrong not to tell you about some of the investors. I admit that. But the audit, the freeze doing it here? It's cruel. It's small compared to what was planned for me," I said. "A life pushed to the edges. My name erased from the story I paid for." I wanted to take her face in my hands the way I used to when she woke from a bad dream. I wanted to tell her there was a way back that didn't require public penance and expensive lawyers, only an honest apology and a willingness to rebuild with different bricks. But I had learned the cost of rescuing people from lessons written with their own hand. "Release the accounts," she whispered. "Please. If not for me, then for the staff." Ethan laughed softly, a sound that wanted to be amused and landed as threatened. "You imagine yourself a general," he said. "You sent some letters. You scared some donors. The store will survive." "The store will survive," I agreed. "You won't," meaning your father knows now, I said. "And he is a man who prefers embarrassment to risk. He will cut you out to cauterize the wound." I glanced at the elder Harrington, who had stopped pacing and was regarding his son with the terrible patience of a banker reviewing a note come due. "He will tell the people he plays golf with that love makes men foolish, but accountants restore order. You will go on a long trip to think. You will return with a story about refocusing. Later," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "Tomorrow we will be very busy. Tonight we are finished." I turned to go, then paused. There is a cruelty that comes from pride, and a firmness that comes from love. I had promised myself I would know the difference in the moment it mattered. "Ethan," I said without looking back, "when you tell this story later, you will say I humiliated you. You will skip the part where you priced my presence and made my daughter choose applause over blood. Tell the story however you need to sleep. Just know I am done subsidizing it." I took 3 steps and felt Sophie's hand on my arm. Not gripping, not pulling, resting there, small and trembling. "Mom," she said. One word, not a plea, a memory. I didn't turn. "I am not slamming a door," I said. "I am locking a drawer." "What does that mean?" "It means I will keep the photographs," I said. "But I will not let you pawn them for a narrative." Her finger slipped away. I walked toward the edge of the deck where the stairs spilled onto the sand. Each step felt like a bead sliding on a cord I had worn so long I'd forgotten its weight. By the time I reached the bottom, my shoulders had dropped an inch. The sea met me with its honest hush. The valet line had stretched into a ribbon of silk dresses and loosened ties, a chorus of polite excuses and sudden migraines. A woman I recognized from a charity board nodded to me the way people nod in church when a hymn catches the right note. No malice. A kind of relief. Truth rearranges rooms. Sometimes the chairs end up where they should have been all along. Karen's car pulled around, the gray convertible idling like a cat at the curb. She didn't open with congratulations or questions. She has always known that some victories require a little silence to fit inside your chest. We drove along the harbor where the lamps hung low and old houses leaned toward the water as if listening for gossip. My phone pulsed once. Then again, messages from numbers I recognized and numbers I did not. I turned it face down in my lap. "You did not gloat," Karen said after a while. Her voice was half proud, half worried, like a parent on the first day of school. "There is nothing to gloat over," I said. "I did not win a prize. I ended a pattern." She nodded. "That is harder." We crossed a bridge that held the last of the day's heat the way a hand holds a blessing. The road unspooled, and with it, plans I had kept tucked inside the ache behind my ribs. "Tomorrow," Karen said, back to business. 9 o'clock. We have the call with the board. Then counsel for the Harrington family. Then your walkthrough at the space on King Street. I smiled, despite the fatigue tugging at my bones. The space on King Street. Narrow, with a pressed tin ceiling and a wide front window that made morning light behave like a promise. I had stood there 2 weeks earlier while the landlord talked about square footage, and I tried to remember the last time I let myself imagine a place with my name on the lease. "What will you call it?" Karen asked. "You never said." "I don't know," I admitted. I have a list of pretty words that sounded thin when I said them out loud. "Not Linda's," she said, and we both laughed. "No," I said. "Not mine like a flag. Mine like a table with room." We passed a small park where children had left chalk drawings on the pavement suns with too many rays, stick houses with hearts for windows. You could feel the day's laughter still clinging to the grass. It made me think of Sophie at 5, at 7, at 12 years when she believed the world was big enough for everyone she loved. I put my hand over my heart and pressed once. Grief and gratitude throbbed under my palm like twins. Karen's phone vibrated again. "Do you want updates?" she asked. "Tomorrow." I paused. "Unless something is on fire." "Only reputations," she said. "Those will smolder, not burn." She dropped me at my townhouse on the quieter end of the peninsula, a place with creaking floors and a porch that collects morning light the way a soup pot collects Sunday. I stood on the stoop a moment and let the night fold around me. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea I'd left on the counter before the ceremony. I washed my face, turned on the lamp by the old armchair, and sat with my journal open on my knees. The pen hovered before landing in a loop and a line that steadied into words. Today I did not ask to be loved in order to be safe. The sentence startled me with its plainness. So much of my life had been an equation where safety equaled compliance, where approval equaled a place at the table. It is a rare mercy to learn the math is different. I wrote until the page filled with a careful record of facts: the time the envelopes were delivered, the order of calls, the names of the people who met my eyes without flinching. Then I turned the page and wrote what I could not have said aloud at the reception without breaking. "If she calls," I wrote, "I will answer. If he calls, I will not. If she asks for forgiveness, I will not barter it for good behavior. Forgiveness is a gift. Trust is a job. She can apply when she is ready to work." I closed the journal and rested both hands on its cover as if blessing a loaf of bread. The knock came just before midnight. Soft, unsure. In Charleston, a late knock can be a neighbor with an extra slice of cake or a storm warning. I went to the door without fear. On the porch stood Marcy, hair frizzed by the humidity, dress wrinkled in a way that said she had changed her mind 3 times on the way over. She held a brown paper parcel tied with kitchen string. "I heard," she said, voice small but steady. "I mean, people posted, and then took it down, and then texted. I did not want to be one more person asking what happened." She lifted the parcel. "So I brought this." Inside was a dress. Russet linen, hand-dyed, the color of clay pots on a southern porch. Simple, honest. The kind of dress you wear to do something brave because it does not ask you to pretend. "I was saving it for the fall market," Marcy said, twisting the string in her hands. "But when I heard you were taking a space, I wanted you to have the first. For the window." I traced the hem with my fingertips. "It is perfect." She let out a breath that seemed to come from 3 years ago. "Do you think—" She stopped, corrected herself. "If there is room, I would like to make more. For your store, however many you want, however few." "There will be room," I said. "Not because pity is a strategy, because you make things with a story that does not apologize for being real." Her eyes filled. She nodded and then laughed at herself for crying. "I was afraid I would always be the girl who got cut when the lighting improved." "You were never the cut," I said. "You were the lamp." When she left, the hallway looked different with the dress hanging from the hook by the mirror like the house had swallowed a small sun. I turned off the porch light and stood a while in the dark, letting my eyes learn the outlines of this new shape of peace. My phone, face down on the table, lit the wood with a soft rectangle. A message from a number that had sat in my favorites since before favorite lists were a feature. "Mom, are you awake?" I did not pick it up immediately. I went to the sink and filled a glass with water and drank half of it slowly. I counted my breaths to 8 and back to 1. When my hands were steady, I sat and unlocked the screen. "I am awake," I typed. A long pause. Then another bubble. "I do not know what to say. I am angry and I know I have no right to be. Everything feels like it is sliding. Ethan is... I do not know who he is right now. People left. Dad Harrington said some things. I do not want to type them." I let her have the space. Words rush to fill silence when we are afraid of what the quiet will say back. I have learned to wait. Another bubble. "Did you ever think I could fix this?" "Not the money. Me." I looked at the dress on the hook, at the journal on the table, at the lamp casting its patient circle. "Yes," I wrote. "I think you can fix you. Not tonight. Not with apologies meant to plug holes. With work. With telling the truth so often you recognize your own voice again." Another pause. Then, "Will you help me?" I closed my eyes and let the ache move through me without lodging. There it was, the small, stubborn grace that keeps mothers from turning to salt. "I will not help you avoid consequences," I wrote. "I will sit with you while you face them. There is a difference." No reply came. I set the phone down, then turned it face down again. A small discipline that felt like sealing a letter with wax. Outside, the wind swung the live oaks into a soft, steady dance. Somewhere, a church bell counted midnight, with the patience of a city that has seen more than its share of weddings and reckonings. I went to the window and pressed my palm to the glass, the way I used to when Sophie and I lived in a room that smelled of cabbage, and I wanted to remind myself the world extended beyond our small square. Tomorrow would bring paperwork and paint chips and phone calls that began with frosty politeness and thawed into something like respect. It would also bring headlines with more adjectives than facts. There would be people who chose Ethan's version because it preserved their investments in him, and people who avoided mine because truth has a way of rearranging friendships. But there would be a key in my pocket for a narrow shop with a pressed tin ceiling. There would be a dress for the window that told a story without shouting. There would be a table with room for people who make things with their hands and their whole lives. I turned off the lamp and let the dark settle, not as a threat, but as Sabbath. In it, I could hear the sea again, even though Charleston keeps it at a long, polite distance, a hush that reminded me the tides come whether or not we clap. In the morning, I would brew tea and answer the call from the board and say yes to a lease, and ask Marcy how many yards of linen she needed if we were to fill a window in a week with hope. In the morning, I would tell Karen the name I had not found last week but had found tonight. Not mine like a flag, mine like a table. A long table. Because there is room. Because there is work. Because there is grace enough to pass the salt and listen while someone learns how to tell their story without erasing the hands that held them up. For now, there was only this. The steady of my own breath. The small weight of my phone sleeping. And a house that, for the first time in a very long time, felt exactly the size of one life lived honestly. Morning in Charleston can be too bright if you haven't slept. The sun comes in with a kind of brass band cheer, flooding every corner of the room whether you're ready or not. I stood at my kitchen counter with a mug of tea, the steam curling into the light, and decided that I was ready enough. Karen was due in an hour, but the board call was first. I dressed in what I thought of as my truth uniform slate. Blue blouse, no jewelry, hair pulled back, no armor, no performance. Just the woman who had signed those incorporation papers 3 years ago with her savings, her name, and her faith. At exactly 9, the laptop chimed. 3 faces appeared in their little rectangles, all framed by tasteful home offices. 2 men and a woman, all of whom had smiled at Sophie's launch party and told me how proud I must be. Now, their smiles were thin. "Linda," began Mitchell, the senior member, "this is unusual. You understand the disruption last night caused?" "Yes," I said. "I also understand that continued unauthorized withdrawals would have been a larger disruption when creditors came calling." He cleared his throat. "The board was not aware of, which is why an audit is necessary," I cut in. "You have my documentation. The transfers to Clark Holdings began 6 months ago. They were disguised as marketing expenditures, but no deliverables exist. My attorney has copies of the bank statements and invoices. We're not here to debate whether it happened. We're here to decide what to do now." A pause. Then Marla, the lone woman on the board, leaned forward. "Linda, you hold 51%. We can't override this action without your consent." "I'm aware," I said. Mitchell frowned. "You could have brought this to us privately, and given the parties involved time to cover their tracks?" I shook my head. "Number transparency is immediate, or it's nothing at all." There was a murmur of agreement from Marla. The other man, a finance consultant named Harris, cleared his throat. "We will proceed with the audit, but the boutique's public image. I've already spoken to the PR team." Karen's voice came from off-screen as she stepped into view beside me. "We'll release a statement framing this as a proactive measure to ensure fiscal integrity during expansion. Your clients will respect that." Mitchell didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "Very well. The audit begins Monday. Linda, you'll have full access to accounts in the meantime?" "Yes. But vendor payments remain paused until we reconcile the books." Staff payroll will be met from my personal reserve if necessary. It was clear they weren't used to a majority owner who meant to act like one. By the time we ended the call, two of them looked as if they'd swallowed something with edges. I logged off without offering the usual pleasantries. Karen handed me another mug of tea. "You were calm," she said. "That unnerves them more than shouting." "I'm too tired to shout," I said. But the truth was, I'd learned a long time ago that a steady voice leaves less for someone else to push against. She flipped open her folder. "Next item, Harrington Council wants a meeting." "Not today. They're worried about Ethan's exposure. There's talk of offering to buy you out to avoid litigation." I set down my mug. "They can send the number in writing. I'm not selling." Karen smiled. The kind of smile that comes from sitting across enough conference tables to know the other side will blink first. "Then let's talk about King Street." We drove there just after 10. The shop front sat between an antique bookstore and a cafe that smelled like cinnamon scones. The pressed tin ceiling inside was even lovelier in daylight, the patterns catching the sun from the front window. I walked the length of the narrow space, imagining shelves, a counter, a window display with Marcy's russet dress at its center. It felt like standing in an empty house you somehow already knew each creak and shadow familiar. "This will be different," Karen said behind me. "Yes," I said. "It will have my name on the lease, but not on the sign. It will be about the work, not the owner." She nodded. "And Sophie?" I let the question hang in the air. The truth was, I didn't know yet. Back at my townhouse, the phone was buzzing again, messages from numbers I didn't recognize, from reporters who wanted a quote, from staff asking if the boutique would reopen, from vendors offering to meet privately. I answered only the one from Marcy. "Do you have dimensions for the window?" she'd written. "I'll measure this afternoon," I replied. "Think in terms of a piece that tells people they've come to the right place." Half an hour later, another message from her. "I have just the thing." By noon, I had an email from Sophie. The subject line was blank. The body read, "Can we talk without lawyers?" I stared at it longer than I meant to. Without lawyers sounded like without witnesses, without a record, without the structure that keeps things from sliding back into the same old grooves. I typed, "Not yet. When you're ready to talk with full transparency, I will listen." Then I closed my laptop. Karen and I spent the afternoon meeting with a contractor about paint and shelving for the King Street space. I picked a shade called Harbor Mist, pale gray with a whisper of blue, the color of morning before the sun gets bold. It would be a quiet backdrop, letting the work speak for itself. The contractor promised a 2-week turnaround. 2 weeks. After years of my life being measured in double shifts and deferred plans, 2 weeks felt like the blink of an eye. That night, I sat on my porch with the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, listening to the crickets. My phone lit up again this time with a photo. Sophie, in her apartment, hair pulled back, no makeup. In her lap was a shoebox. "These are the letters you sent me at college," she wrote. "I never threw them away. I thought maybe you'd want them back." I typed, "Keep them. They were meant for you." Then I put the phone down and let the night breathe around me. Some wounds need time before they can even begin to scar. The next morning, Karen texted, "Harringtons want to meet. Just the father this time." We agreed to coffee at a quiet cafe off Broad Street. He arrived in a navy blazer. The lines of exhaustion around his eyes softened only slightly by the smell of fresh roast in the air. "I'll be direct," he said after we'd sat down. "My son was reckless. He will face the consequences within our family. But the public fallout, it can be contained. If you lift the freeze, we can avoid spectacle." I stirred my coffee. "You mean avoid your family name in the audit report?" He didn't deny it. "We're prepared to cover the missing funds." "Entirely." "That's not the point," I said. "The point is accountability. The store is not a personal bank account. Sophie needs to understand that." He studied me for a long moment. "You remind me of my sister," he said finally. "She was the only one in our family who could walk away from money and sleep at night." I didn't respond. Some comparisons are meant as flattery, but all they really do is point out how rare it is to choose integrity over comfort. In the end, he agreed to cooperate with the audit, to make restitution quietly, and to keep Ethan from interfering with operations. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. That afternoon, I went back to King Street with my tape measure. The space smelled faintly of sawdust from the shelving installation. Sunlight poured through the window, landing on the spot where Marcy's dress would hang. I imagined passers-by stopping, leaning in, seeing not just fabric, but hours of human hands, the kind of care you can't fake. I took a photo of the empty space and sent it to Marcy. Soon, I wrote. Her reply was just 2 words. Can't wait. And for the first time in a long while, neither could I. The smell of fresh paint is a promise. It clings to the air like the first page of a new notebook, full of possibility and untouched by mistakes. By the time the harbor mist gray had dried on the walls of the King Street shop, I could stand in the middle of the room and almost see it finished shelves, lined with dresses, blouses, and scarves, all made by hands that knew the weight of their craft. The contractor's crew had been efficient, and when they left, the space felt bigger, as if it had been holding its breath and finally let it out. I spent the first afternoon sweeping the floor myself, even though the dust was minimal. There's a kind of grounding that comes from cleaning your own space, from knowing every corner before anyone else touches it. Marcy arrived just before sunset, her arms wrapped around a garment bag almost as tall as she was. "Window piece," she said, her eyes bright. "But it's more than just a mannequin display, it tells a story." We laid the dress across the counter, the russet linen glowing warm against the cool gray walls. She'd stitched a band of embroidery along the hem, waves, palm fronds, and tiny birds in flight. "It's Charleston," she said. "But not the tourist Charleston. It's the Charleston that wakes up before dawn to fish, the one that smells like salt and bread baking." I traced the stitches with my fingers. "It's perfect." We spent the next hour rearranging the front display, angling the dress so it caught the natural light from the window. Passers-by slowed, their eyes drawn to the scene even though the shop wasn't yet open. A couple even cupped their hands against the glass to get a closer look. "It's already working," Marcy whispered. The days filled quickly after that. I met with 3 more local artisans who wove silk scarves on a hand loom, another who made leather handbags in her garage, and a potter whose glazed bowls looked like they'd been scooped from the marsh at low tide. Each of them walked into the shop cautiously, as if they'd been braced for the usual. A polite smile, a compliment about their work, and a gentle, "not the right fit for our brand." Instead, I asked them about their process, their materials, and what they wanted their work to say about them. It startled them at first. One of the scarf makers, a quiet woman named Elise, blinked twice before saying, "No one's ever asked me that before." "That's the first thing I want customers to know," I told her. "Who made this and why?" One afternoon, while I was unboxing a shipment of handmade ceramics, Sophie appeared in the doorway. She wasn't dressed for a boutique launch or a charity luncheon, just jeans and a pale sweater, her hair pulled into a loose bun. For a moment, she looked almost like the college student who used to visit me between classes, telling me about her marketing projects over takeout noodles. "I heard you were opening soon," she said. Her voice was careful, testing the ground. "I am," I said, keeping my tone even. She stepped inside, looking around. "It's different from the boutique. That's the idea." We stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me about this place?" I met her eyes. "Because it's mine. Not in the sense of excluding you, but in the sense that it's not built on sacrifice I can't afford anymore." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she walked over to the window display and studied Marcy's dress. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," I agreed. "I let her go," Sophie said after a pause. "I thought I was making the right move for the brand. I didn't think about what it meant for her." "That's the difference between building a business and building a life," I said. She turned back to me, and for a second, the steel in her eyes softened. "Do you want help with the opening?" I considered her. "If you mean publicity, no. If you mean showing up and pouring coffee for customers, yes." She almost smiled. "I think I can do that." The opening was set for a Saturday morning. I baked lemon bread the night before, the scent filling the townhouse like a memory of simpler times. Marcy brought fresh flowers in tall glass jars. Elise draped scarves over the new shelving. and the potter arranged her bowls in stacks of blues and greens that caught the light. Sophie arrived early, wearing a plain white apron over her clothes. "Where do you want me?" she asked. "By the door," I said. "Greet people, tell them what's here." And she did. For 2 hours. She shook hands, offered coffee, and introduced customers to the makers. She didn't talk about herself, didn't steer the conversation toward her own ventures. She listened. The room filled with the hum of voices and the clink of mugs against saucers. People lingered, touching fabrics, running fingers over pottery glazes, asking questions about the makers. At one point, I caught Sophie watching me from across the room. There was no resentment in her gaze this time, just something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. Or the first stirrings of understanding. That evening, after we'd locked up and the last crumb had been swept from the floor, Sophie stayed behind. "You did this," she said simply, looking around the shop. "Yes," I said. "You didn't need me." I shook my head. "I needed you to know I could." She nodded slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "It's a list," she said. "Local suppliers I've worked with who might fit your vision. No strings attached." I took it from her, the paper warm from her hand. "Thank you." We stood there in the fading light, and for the first time in a long while, the space between us felt less like a wall and more like a bridge we might one day finish building. By the end of the first week, sales were steady. But more than that, conversations were happening. Customers came back not just to buy, but to ask Elise how long it took to weave a scarf, or to see if the potter had finished the bowl they'd admired. It wasn't just commerce, it was connection. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving or protecting. I was creating. One evening, Marcy stopped by after closing, a paper bag of pastries in her hand. "I heard Sophie talking to a customer today," she said. She told them the dress in the window was made by a friend of her mother's, said it was the heart of the shop. I smiled. "Maybe she's learning the math." "What math?" Marcy asked. "The kind where success isn't subtraction," I said. "It's addition. You don't make room by cutting people out. You make it by building a bigger table." Marcy grinned. "Sounds like a good name for a store." I laughed. "Already taken." By the third week after the opening, my shop on King Street had settled into a rhythm. Morning light pooled through the front window, turning the embroidery on Marcy's dress into gold. The smell of coffee from the cafe next door drifted in every time a customer pushed open the door. I'd begun to recognize the regulars, the retiree who bought a new scarf every Friday for his wife, the young mother who brought her toddler in to pick the softest bowl, the tourist couple who returned twice in the same day because they couldn't decide which piece they loved most. Business was modest, but it was honest. Every sale had a face, a name, and a story behind it. That mattered more to me now than numbers on a spreadsheet. Then one afternoon, Karen walked in with the expression she usually reserved for telling me bad weather was coming. "Board call?" I guessed. She nodded. "Audit's almost finished. It's worse than we thought." I put down the ceramic mug I'd been pricing. "How bad?" She closed the shop door behind her. "Ethan used the boutique's accounts as collateral for a personal loan. Multiple times. Some of the lenders are private names you don't want to be indebted to." My stomach tightened. "And Sophie?" "She's on the paperwork as managing partner, which means she's legally tied to every one of those moves. The Harrington family is scrambling to isolate Ethan, but if Sophie doesn't cooperate, she'll go down with him." I sank into the chair behind the counter. "Has she said anything?" Karen hesitated. "She's not calling me, but she's called you, hasn't she?" I thought of the blank subject email, the shoebox photo, the list of suppliers. None of it was a confession, but none of it was nothing. "She's reaching," I said quietly. "Just not all the way yet." Karen pulled a folder from her bag. "The board will offer her an outstep aside, sign over her share, and they'll keep her name out of the legal filings, but she has to choose it. Soon." That evening, I was restocking scarves when Sophie came in. She didn't look like someone who'd been working a boutique floor all day. Her blazer was wrinkled, her hair pulled back hastily, and her eyes carried that hollow shine you get from running too hard without moving forward. "Ethan's been gone since Tuesday," she said without preamble. "Where?" I asked. I don't know. His father says out of town. I think it's more like out of reach. She exhaled sharply. The auditors came to the boutique. The staff looked at me like I was a stranger walking into my own store. I stayed silent, letting her find her way to the next truth. They showed me documents, she said. Loans I never knew about. Transfers with my signature. I recognized the pen but not the hand. He forged me, Mom. I felt the words land in my chest, heavy but not surprising. What do I do? She asked, her voice small. I took a moment before answering. You stop pretending you can fix him. You stop thinking this is about salvaging an image. And you decide if you want to be free, even if it means starting over. Her eyes glistened. The board offered me a deal. Step away, hand over my share to Themor to you, and they'll protect my name. And Ethan? He'll take the fall. His father will make sure of it. But they can't save us both if I stay tied to him. I studied her face. Do you want to hand over your share to me? She swallowed hard. Do you want it? I thought about the years of work, the money I'd poured into that boutique, the way I'd imagined it as a future for her and maybe a legacy for both of us. But I also thought about the shop on King Street, the calm I felt there, the absence of panic. No, I said finally. I want you to hand it over to the board. Let them clean it up. Walk away before it eats you alive. She blinked. That's it? No. I told you so? No lecture? You already know what I'd say, I replied. And you're tired enough to hear it in your own head without my help. A week later, the papers were signed. Sophie stepped away from the boutique. The press release called it a strategic change in leadership. But the people who mattered knew better. Ethan's name disappeared from the public side of the business entirely. Rumors swirled about settlements and family meetings that ended with slammed doors. I didn't ask Sophie for details. She came to the King Street shop more often now, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit in the corner and drink coffee while customers browsed. Marcy taught her how to steam garments without warping the fabric. Elise showed her how to tell real silk from synthetics by touch. One afternoon, a customer recognized Sophie. Weren't you the owner of... She began naming the boutique. I was, Sophie said simply. This is better. The woman looked surprised, but she smiled and bought a scarf. Meanwhile, word about the King Street shop was spreading. A travel blogger posted a photo of Marcy's dress in the window with the caption, Handmade Dreams in Charleston. A local food and craft festival asked if I'd host a booth. It wasn't fame, but it was steady, and steady was a language I spoke fluently. One evening, after closing, Sophie lingered while I counted the till. You're happy here, she said, almost as a question. I am, I said. It's not big, she said. It's enough. She nodded, then pulled a folded sheet of paper from her bag. I made this for you. It was a mock-up of a simple website photos of the shop, profiles of the makers, a section for online orders. It's not a rebrand, she said quickly. It's a window, in case people can't walk past King Street. I smiled. Let's talk about it tomorrow. That night, I sat on my porch and thought about the difference between saving someone and giving them room to save themselves. Sophie was still walking that line, but at least she was walking it in daylight now. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably spinning a new story, finding someone else's resources to play with. But that was no longer my problem. And, more importantly, no longer hers. In the quiet, I realized something. My life was no longer defined by what I had to defend against. It was defined by what I could build. And that, more than any audit or settlement, was the real turning point. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with me. By late October, the air in Charleston had shifted. The heat that clung to your skin in July was gone, replaced by a softness that carried the faint scent of magnolia leaves turning brittle. Tourists still wandered King Street with their paper cups of cider, but the pace had slowed. The shop had found its heartbeat in that rhythm steady, familiar, warm. I started opening the doors earlier, letting the cool air roll in while I arranged the morning display. Sometimes Marcy would join me with a fresh piece she'd finished the night before. Elise had begun to host a Saturday scarf-tying hour in the corner. showing customers ways to drape and knot fabric like a small act of self-expression. It wasn't just a store anymore, it was a meeting place. One Thursday morning, a local teacher stopped in with 3 of her students, teenagers from the high school art program. They lingered over the shelves, asking Marcy about fabric dyes and Elise about loom weaving. When they left, the teacher handed me a card. "We're always looking for mentors," she said. "If you ever feel like sharing your skills." I held the card for a long moment after she left. Skills. I'd spent most of my life thinking my only skill was survival, but maybe that wasn't true anymore. That weekend, I hosted the first Maker's Morning at the shop. We pushed the racks to the sides, set out folding tables, and invited the artisans to bring their tools. Marcy demonstrated embroidery stitches. Elise let visitors try the loom. The potter rolled out clay for small pinch bowls. We served coffee and muffins from the cafe next door. By 10 o'clock, the shop was humming. People who had never thought of themselves as crafty were laughing over uneven stitches or comparing clay smudges on their palms. A woman in her 70s leaned toward me and said, "I didn't know I could still learn something new at my age." I smiled. "It's never too late to surprise yourself." Sophie showed up halfway through, in jeans and sneakers, carrying 2 trays of scones. "From a bakery I've been helping with their marketing," she explained as she set them on the counter. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started pouring coffee for guests, moving easily among the tables. For a while, I just watched her. Not the Sophie from the boutique launch parties or the Sophie from the boardroom, but a version of my daughter who looked at people instead of past them. After the event wound down, we sat at the back counter, the scent of coffee and warm pastries still in the air. "You've made something here," she said. "Not just a shop, a whole, I don't know, feeling." "That's the goal," I said. She hesitated. "I've been thinking about starting over, not with a boutique, something smaller, community-based, like this." I looked at her carefully. "If you do, start with the people you want to stand beside you, not just the ones who look good in a photo." She nodded. I learned that the hard way. There was no apology in her voice, but there was no defensiveness either. That was enough for now. The following week, the shop received an invitation to join the Charleston Winter Market, a 3-day event in the historic district where local businesses set up stalls under strings of lights. Karen encouraged me to accept. "It's good exposure," she said, "and a chance to cement your place here." I agreed, but part of me worried about leaving the shop itself unattended for so long. Sophie volunteered immediately. "I can keep it running while you're at the market," she said. "Are you sure?" I asked. She smiled. "I think I can handle customers and a cash register." The winter market was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Lanterns hung from the old oak trees, and the cobblestone streets were lined with stalls selling everything from hand-carved ornaments to jars of local honey. Our booth was small but inviting, with Marcy's dress displayed front and center and a table of scarves, ceramics, and leather goods arranged like an art piece. The first night, a woman picked up one of Elise's scarves and said, "I saw this shop on King Street but didn't have time to go in. Now I'll make sure to visit." That was the moment I understood the market wasn't about sales. It was about invitation. When I returned to the shop after the 3rd day, I found Sophie behind the counter, laughing with a customer. The register tape showed she'd made steady sales, but what struck me more was the way she introduced the makers. She used their names, told their stories. After the customer left, she looked at me and grinned. "You're going to have to hire me at this rate." "Careful?" I said. "I might take you up on that." That night, after locking up, Sophie walked me to my car. "You know," she said, "when Ethan first started talking about expanding the boutique, I thought bigger meant better. More space, more money, more attention. But here, it's not big, and it's better." I smiled. "Sometimes growth is sideways, not up." She laughed softly. "You should put that on a sign." The next morning, I opened my email to find a message from the high school art teacher. She wanted to bring her students back for a monthly workshop. I typed my reply without hesitation. "Yes. Let's start in January." When I hit send, I realized that the decision came without the old mental calculation. How much time will this take? What will it cost? What will I lose? For the first time in decades, I was living in a space where giving didn't mean being emptied. Sophie still had her own mess to sort through. The boutique had moved on under new leadership, and her name was no longer on the door. Ethan had vanished into whatever exile his father arranged. Occasionally, whispers about settlements reached me through Karen, but I let them pass. They weren't my concern. What was my concern was the woman standing next to me at the counter, helping a customer choose between two mugs, saying, "Pick the one you'll want to hold every morning." It was such a small thing, but it was exactly right. The week after the winter market, the shop was busier than I'd ever seen it. People who'd passed by our booth came through the door, still carrying the market's paper bags, their scarves pulled tight against the crisp December wind. They'd point to Marcy's dress in the window and say, "I saw that under the lights last weekend." Or they'd recognize a ceramic bowl and ask for one just like the one with the marsh green glaze. It wasn't a rush that would make anyone rich, but it was steady, predictable, the kind of business that could take root. One Thursday morning, just as I was hanging a new batch of hand-woven wraps, Karen walked in with her leather tote slung over her shoulder. Her eyes had that particular glint that meant she was bringing news, the kind you had to decide whether to call an opportunity or a temptation. "Got a meeting for you," she said. "Big deal. Could change things." I raised an eyebrow. Change things how? She pulled out a glossy folder and slid it across the counter. Inside were photos of smiling models, open-air markets, and brand banners flapping in the breeze. "Harbor and Finch," she said. "They're a regional lifestyle brand, clothing, housewares, food lines. They want a partnership. You'd keep your name, but they'd bring in capital, advertising, and a pop-up space in their Savannah and Asheville stores." I flipped through the folder. The images were beautiful, polished, curated to within an inch of their lives. "What's the catch?" "They want exclusivity on your artisans," she said. "Meaning Marcy, a lease. The potter they'd only sell through you, and through Harbor and Finch's channels." I closed the folder. "That's not how we work." "Linda," she said gently, "this is serious money. Security. You could grow." I looked around the shop, the soft light, the quiet hum when customers spoke with the makers, the smell of fresh coffee from next door. "We are growing," I said. "Sideways." Karen smiled faintly. "I thought you'd say that, but meet with them anyway. No harm in hearing them out." The meeting was set for Monday at a waterfront hotel downtown. I asked Sophie to open the shop that morning. She didn't hesitate. "I've got it," she said. Walking into the hotel conference room, I was greeted by two representatives from Harbor and Finch, a woman in a sharp navy dress and a man in a blazer the color of oatmeal. They were warm, professional, clearly good at their jobs. They talked about scaling the story of my shop, about bringing authenticity to a broader audience. They used phrases like curated narrative and heritage brand alignment. I listened politely. When they finished, I asked one question. "How do you tell a story without owning it?" The woman smiled as if she'd been expecting it. "We believe in collaboration," she said. "We'd work with you every step of the way." I thought of Marcy hand-stitching palm fronds along a hem, of Elise showing a teenager how to weave a line of silk, of the potter pulling a bowl from the kiln with her hands still smelling of clay. "And what happens when their timelines don't match your seasonal campaign?" I asked. There was a pause, brief, but long enough to feel. The man said, "We'd help them adapt. That's the nature of growth." I closed my notebook. "Then I think we want different things." They looked surprised, but not offended. We shook hands, and I left with the folder still in my bag, unopened. Back at the shop, Sophie was ringing up a customer. She waited until the door closed behind them before asking, "So? They want exclusivity," I said. "It's a no." A flicker of relief crossed her face, though she didn't say it out loud. "Good," she said instead. "Because Marcy was talking about expanding her line for the spring. She wants to add jackets. She said she's never had this much freedom to experiment." I smiled. "That's worth more than a glossy campaign." That evening, Sophie stayed after closing to help rearrange the front display. As we worked, she said, "I've been thinking about what you said at the market, about starting with the people you want beside you." I glanced at her. "Have you made a list?" She nodded. "Small, focused, There's a cafe in Mount Pleasant that does these incredible baking workshops. The owner's been wanting to pair them with a retail space books, cookware, locally made kitchen goods. I think I could help her grow it without turning it into, you know, a machine. That sounds like a start, I said. She looked almost shy. Would you look over the plan when it's ready? Of course. The next Saturday, the high school art students returned for their first official monthly workshop. The shop buzzed with their energy. They asked questions without hesitation, their laughter spilling out into the street. One girl embroidered her name along the edge of a scarf. Another shaped a clay mug with her initials pressed into the bottom. Watching them, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. This was what I'd wanted all along, not the kind of growth you could chart on a graph, but the kind that sank deep roots. Sophie lingered at the edge of the room, handing out muffins and chatting with the students. At one point, she caught my eye and mouthed, "This is good." And it was. That night, I sat on my porch with the Harbor and Finch folder beside me. I opened it one last time, leafing through the images. There was nothing wrong with them, they were beautiful, in their way. But they were someone else's version of a story I'd spent my whole life learning how to tell. I closed it for good, slid it into the recycling bin, and went inside to write tomorrow's to-do list. At the top, I wrote, "Call Marcy about jackets." By mid-January, Charleston had settled into that quiet lull between the holidays and spring's first blooms. The shop's door chime still rang steadily, but the rush had eased into something more deliberate. People came in with time to linger, to ask questions, to run their fingers over the hand-stitched hems and the smooth edges of pottery bowls. Sophie had been spending more time here, not because she had to, but because she seemed to want to. Some mornings she'd arrive before me with coffee and a box of biscuits from a bakery she was courting for her new venture. She didn't talk about Ethan anymore, and when his name did come up, it was in a tone that suggested he belonged to another chapter, one she'd already closed. One Thursday afternoon, just as I was showing a customer a set of Marcy's new linen jackets, Sophie slipped a folder onto the counter. "I think I'm ready," she said. I glanced at it but didn't open it yet. "For what?" "For you to see the plan." After the customer left, I locked the door and flipped through the folder. She'd laid out the vision for a small retail cafe hybrid in Mount Pleasant baking workshops in the morning, cafe hours in the afternoon, retail shelves with locally made kitchen goods and cookbooks. There were lists of potential partners, sample menus, even sketches of how the space could look. "You've done your homework," I said, impressed. She leaned on the counter. "I've been meeting with the cafe owner every week. We're aligned on everything. The only thing I'm still figuring out is funding." I looked up at her. "And you're not here to ask me for it?" She shook her head. "Number, I've learned enough from you to know that if I can't start this without putting someone else at risk, I'm not ready." Something in my chest loosened. "That's the smartest thing you've said in months." The following weekend, the high school art students were back for their workshop. The shop filled with the warm scent of clay and fresh coffee. Marcy had brought an unfinished jacket for the students to try stitching. Elise had the looms set up in the corner, and the potter was showing how to carve patterns into wet clay. Halfway through, a familiar figure stepped in Sophie's old friend from college, Lila, the one who'd helped her during the boutique's early days. I hadn't seen her in years. "Linda," she said warmly, hugging me. "This place is incredible. I've been following on Instagram. Sophie's been posting about it." I glanced at my daughter, who shrugged with a small smile. Lila wandered the shop, talking with the students and asking questions about the pieces. Before she left, she pulled Sophie aside. "I caught fragments. Proud of you. Different energy. Keep going." Sophie looked almost shy hearing it. Later that week, Karen came by with her usual tote and a cautious expression. "I wish I didn't have to bring this," she began, "but the Harrington family has reached out again. This time, through their attorneys." My stomach tightened. "What do they want now?" "They're offering a settlement to close out all remaining disputes from the audit. It's a generous payout, but they want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement that bars you from discussing Ethan's actions ever." I set down the teacup in my hand. "So they want to buy my silence." Karen nodded. "It's a lot of money, Linda. Enough to expand this shop or even open another." I thought about the Harbor and Finch offer, the glossy folders, the quiet certainty I'd felt recycling them. If I take it, I'm telling Sophie and everyone else that the truth is for sale. That's not what I'm building here. Karen exhaled, relieved. I figured you'd say that. I'll draft a polite refusal. The very next day, the test of that resolve arrived in the form of Sophie herself. She came in after closing, a little windblown from the damp January air. I heard from Dad Harrington, she said carefully. He says if you sign the NDA, it will make it easier for me to get investors for my new project. They won't have to worry about bad press by association. I looked at her for a long moment. And what do you think? She shifted. I think it would make things simpler. But I also think it would be asking you to carry a lie for the rest of your life. And? I prompted. And I don't want that. Not for you and not for me. I felt something shift between us, subtle but unmistakable. This was the first time she'd put principle ahead of convenience without me having to draw the map for her. Then it settled, I said. By the end of the month, Sophie's Mount Pleasant project was moving from sketches to site visits. She'd found a small corner space next to the cafe, with tall windows and just enough room for shelves and a central table for workshops. One afternoon, she invited me to walk it with her. It's not much yet, she said, pushing open the door. The space smelled faintly of old wood and coffee drifting in from next door. The light was soft, and I could see it, not as it was, but as it could be. It's enough, I said. She grinned. That's what you always say. That night, back at my townhouse, I sat with my journal open, thinking about the months behind us. We hadn't erased the damage, some things you don't erase. But Sophie was making choices with her eyes open now, not through the fog of ambition fed by someone else's greed. The shop was thriving in its own quiet way. The students would be back next month. Marcy was finishing her first batch of jackets. Elise had just sold out of her winter scarves and was already working on spring colors. And I, for the first time in years, wasn't bracing for the next blow. I was making plans. The first warm day of February arrived like a quiet apology for winter. Charleston does that sometime slips you a handful of mild air and sunlight and pretends the cold never happened. I propped the shop door open and let the breeze drift over the displays. The embroidery on Marcy's spring jackets lifted in the draft like grass after rain. Sophie texted just after 8. Soft opening tonight. 6 o'clock. Will you come early? I smiled at the screen. Her Mount Pleasant space had been a sketch on paper only a month ago. Now it had shelves, a name, and a calendar pinned to the wall with penciled-in workshops. She'd chosen a simple sign in block letters. The hearth table. No gilded script. No tagline. Just an invitation. I'll be there at 5, I wrote back. Need anything? Just you. I stood a little straighter at the counter. There are sentences you don't get to hear from your child very often, sometimes not at all. The morning passed with a steady trickle of customers. Elise brought in a run of spring scarves watercolor blues and greens that looked like the marsh learning to breathe again. A retired couple came in for a wedding gift and left with 2 mugs and a promise to return for a bowl big enough for Sunday stew. When the lunch hour thinned, I swept the floors, noted the low stock, and wrote tomorrow's list in my neatest handwriting. At 3, Karen stopped by. You look peaceful, she said, as if it were a condition worth documenting. I am, I said. For now. She lifted a brow. For now? Tonight is Sophie's soft opening. Karen's face softened. I am proud of her. Of you both. I locked the register at 4, hung a small sign that said, back at 10 tomorrow, and turned the brass key in the door. My reflection in the glass surprised menno-tired shadows under the eyes, no jaw clenched against a blow that might or might not come. I looked like a woman on her way to a celebration. Mount Pleasant was all late afternoon glow when I pulled into the small lot beside the cafe. Sophie stood under the new sign, apron on, hair back, cheeks flushed the way they get when she's been moving since dawn, and forgot to count the hours. The cafe owner, a woman named June with quick hands and a laugh that made you think of church potlucks, waved from the doorway. Inside, the space felt exactly the size of one good idea. Shelves lined the walls with cookbooks and wooden spoons and stoneware mixing bowls. A long table ran down the center, set with cutting boards and linen tea towels. A chalkboard near the register read Saturday. Biscuit Basics with June in Sophie's tidy print. She hugged me without preface. You came? I did, I said into her shoulder. It's beautiful. It's small, she said, stepping back, proud and sheepish at the same time. It's enough, I said, and watched her eyes warm at the familiarity of the phrase. The soft opening moved like a potluck, where everyone remembered to bring a main dish and a story. June handed out warm slices of buttered cornbread, while Sophie poured coffee and made introductions. She didn't say, "This is my concept." She said, "This is June," and pointed people to the calendar, letting the work explain itself. I took plates, refilled water, folded napkins without being asked. When the little bell above the door chimed, I looked up by instinct. He stood there as if he'd walked out of a photograph someone had kept in a drawer too long. Time had made him narrower around the shoulders, but the tilt of the head, the quick scan of the room, the mouth that wanted control even when it smiled, those were the same. "Tom," I said. My voice did not shake. It surprised me a little that it didn't. He took off his cap, smoothed his hair with the old habit of a man who thinks appearance can negotiate with truth. "Linda," he said. "Heard you were." "Back?" His gaze flicked to Sophie behind the counter, then back to me, measuring. I felt the old body memory me ribcage bracing, my jaw ready to be quiet. Then the room came into focus again. June's laugh at the register, the clink of ice in a pitcher, the low hum of neighbors asking questions about classes and cookbooks. My present was louder than my past. "What brings you here?" I asked. He gestured around. "I've been doing some electrical work down the block. The boys at the cafe said there was a new shop. Figured I'd stop in." "Shop?" I repeated. "It's a workshop and retail space." "Sophie's." His eyes moved to our daughter. She was wiping the counter, catching the edge of our conversation without yet stepping into it. "You did this?" he asked her. She looked him full in the face. "I did." A beat passed in which the three of us stood in a triangle built years ago and abandoned without demolition. I could hear my own breath and the clock above the chalkboard counting it alongside me. Tom cleared his throat. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said. "Looks nice. Better than that other thing you had." He flapped a hand, as if the boutique were a gnat he could wave away. Sophie didn't flinch. "It is better," she said, "because I can afford it with the truth." He blinked, uncertainty tracking across his features like a shadow passing over water. "Well," he said, defaulting back to an old script, "maybe your old man can help out sometime. I know a guy who can." "No," I said, too gently to be mistaken for anger. "We don't need that kind of help." He turned to me. "You still hard, huh?" I looked at his face older, lined in places I didn't recognize. Still wearing the same entitlement like an undershirt you never take off. I felt compassion that surprised me by existing at all. Not for the man he had been to us, but for the small boy he must have been before he learned to defend himself with fists and control. "Compassion does not require access," I reminded myself. "I am steady," I said. "That's different." The door chime sounded again. Neighbors flowed in on a tide of kind smiles and the promise of cornbread seconds. June called for Sophie, and my daughter stepped away, not looking back to ask permission, not glancing to check my face for instructions. She moved because she had a place to be. Tom watched her go. "She always was stubborn," he said, but there was something in the way he said it that made me think he was testing a new word he didn't quite understand. "Strong," I corrected. "Words matter." He put his cap back on, the old signal that a conversation was ending on his terms. "Well," he said to the room, not quite to me. "Good luck with it." "Thank you," I said, choosing the small courage of ordinary manners. He left without slamming anything. No threat, no muttered names, no doorframe struck by a passing shoulder. The bell chimed once, twice, settled. The air returned to normal. I realized my hands had been still at my sides the whole time. June appeared at my elbow with a fresh slice of cornbread, pressed it into my palm like communion. "You okay, honey?" she asked. In Charleston, the word honey heals more than it ought to. "I am," I said, and I meant it. The rest of the evening unfolded as if the interruption had been a brief storm that rinsed the air. A retired firefighter recounted his grandmother's biscuit technique to an amused circle. A young couple took a photo by the chalkboard calendar and promised to bring friends. Sophie stood at the table with June, showing an older man how to fold parchment for a loaf pan. She laughed easily. No performance, no brittleness, just presence. We closed at 8. The last guests waved from the sidewalk. The cafe lights blinked twice in a neighborly goodnight. Sophie leaned against the counter, tired and lit up from the inside, the way you get when the thing you built actually holds. "You did it," I said. "We did it," she answered, and then her eyes flicked to the door. "Was that your father?" I said. She nodded once. "I thought so. He looks smaller." "Sometimes men do, when you stop standing so far beneath them," I said, and she huffed out a laugh that was mostly relief. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am," I said again. "Are you?" She considered. "I didn't want him here," she said. "But I didn't leave the room. That feels new." "It is new," I said. "And it's enough for tonight." We cleaned in companionable silence. At the door, she hugged me longer than casual. "Thank you for coming early," she said into my shoulder. "Always," I said, and felt how the word had changed meaning. Not rescue, company. The next morning, I opened the King Street shop with a steadiness that felt like a blessing. I set the dress just so, smoothed the table runners, and wrote "Welcome" on the sidewalk chalkboard with a little flourish that would have embarrassed my younger self. By noon, the shop was humming. The high school art teacher came in to confirm the next workshop date. A couple from Ohio picked out a wedding gift and asked about shipping. Marcy brought the first 2 spring jackets with a new stitch around the collar that made them look like they'd learned to smile. I was pouring water for a customer when the bell chimed in, that particular way it chimes when someone is trying not to make a sound. I looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, early 30s, hair scraped into a neat knot that had already begun to break into small rebellions. Her coat was expensive. Her eyes were tired. She hugged a leather tote like a shield. "Can I help you?" I asked, slipping into the tone I use when I sense breakage under the surface. She came to the counter and placed a small, wrapped package on it. "My name is Emily Harrington," she said. "Ethan is my brother." The room tilted. Only a fraction. My hand stayed where it was. "I'm not here to fight with you," she said quickly, reading my stillness like a page. "I am here because I think the truth is heavy, and I have been carrying a part that is not mine." She slid the parcel toward me. I didn't touch it. "What is it?" "Emails," she said. "Printed. Dated. The accountant who flagged the transfers sent them to me months ago, hoping I could get Ethan to stop. I tried. My father prefers to handle things within the family." Her mouth twisted on the word handle. "I thought you should have them in case anyone decides to rewrite history again." I watched her face. There are ways people look when they are offering you a weapon. This was not that. This was a woman returning something she did not want in her house. "Why now?" I asked. She glanced around the shop at Marcy's jacket, at the loom, at a customer's hands resting on a clay bowl like a prayer. "Because I came to the soft opening last night," she said, surprising me. I stood outside a long time and watched through the window. Your daughter looked different, lighter. I realized none of the weight her brother threw around had landed on her in that room. I wanted to help keep it that way. I thought of Sophie showing the older man how to fold parchment, of June's laugh, of the bell's honest chime. I thought of the years I had spent believing I had to block every blow with my body or it would find my child. I thought of how wrong I had been about what protection looks like. "Thank you," I said simply. Emily's shoulders dropped a fraction. "You do not have to use them," she said, nodding at the parcel. "But if anyone asks for your silence again, you should have a choice that isn't a check." She turned as if to go, then paused. "I liked the cornbread," she said, almost shy. "I did not come in, but I liked that the window steamed up and somebody drew a heart in it." "That would be June," I said. "She draws hearts on everything that holds still long enough." Emily smiled, small but real. "Good," she said and left. I put the parcel in the drawer beneath the counter. Not on the shelf where we keep the bags. Not in the safe where the cash sleeps. In the drawer where I keep the extra pens and the notebook with the names of customers I want to remember, because this was not money and not danger. It was a record, and records belong where the truth can reach them. The afternoon lifted itself back into its rhythm. A mother bought a scarf for Sundays when I need to remember my mother's hands. A grandfather chose a mug with a handle big enough for his knuckles and told me about the first car he ever fixed. The door chimed and chimed again, like breath. At closing, I texted Sophie, "How did the day go?" Her reply came with a photo. The long table set with mixing bowls, a handful of smiling faces behind it, June in the center like a candle. Full class. 1 broken measuring cup, 2 burnt edges, 12 biscuits that would make you cry. "Save me one," I wrote. "Already in a bag with your name on it," she sent back. I turned the key in the front door and stood for a moment in the gentle quiet that follows work done honestly. My reflection looked back at me from the glass otter, yes, and lined in ways I'd earned, but softened around the eyes. I pressed my palm to the door and felt the faint cool of evening on the other side. Tomorrow would bring new customers and a phone call from Karen, and maybe a headline that tried to tell our story without asking permission. It might bring a visit from someone who wanted to barter hush for comfort. It might bring nothing but the ordinary grace of a day that holds. Either way, the table was set mine in Charleston. Sophie's in Mount Pleasant. Not big, but long enough for the people we'd chosen to sit with. Not fancy, but honest. Not perfect, but good. I locked up and walked into the soft dark, the kind with room for both rest and beginnings. When I reached my car, I realized I had forgotten to be afraid of the sound of my own footsteps. The next morning, I woke to a thin pink streak stretching across the Ashley River in Charleston. The ceiling fan hummed overhead, and the smell of coffee drifted down the hallway from the kitchen. I poured myself a cup and sat at the dining table, thinking about the envelope Emily had handed me. It was still in the drawer under the counter, nestled between a few ballpoint pens and my old customer ledger. I hadn't opened it yet, maybe because I wasn't ready, or maybe because I knew that once I read it, I couldn't pretend I didn't know. My phone buzzed. A message from Sophie. "Miss June spilled the whole bowl of dough. We need more parchment paper. If you're free, can you drop some off?" I couldn't help but laugh. I could picture June with flour-covered hands and her perfectly calm face as if nothing had happened. I stopped by the shop first, switched on the lights, straightened a few items on the shelves, and then drove over to Mount Pleasant. The hearth table glowed in the early sunlight, laughter spilling out into the walkway along with the warm smell of butter. Sophie was kneeling to pick up bits of torn paper while June stood at the oven, teasing her and preparing the next batch. "You should put up a sign that says, 'Slippery floor flour, hazard,'" I said, setting the stack of parchment paper on the counter. "Probably should," Sophie grinned. "But at least no one's leaving." It was true, the long table was full. A boy of about 10 was carefully cutting dough into circles while his grandmother guided his hands. A middle-aged woman scribbled down the recipe, looking up now and then to ask June about oven temperatures. The air felt less like a commercial class and more like the kitchen of a big, bustling family. I helped wash a few dishes and listened to the stories floating around the table. An older man talked about driving trucks cross-country in his youth, always carrying his mother's biscuits. A young woman who had just moved from the city said, "Here, I feel like I can breathe again." The bell over the door jingled, and I glanced up and froze for just a moment. Emily. She wasn't holding the envelope anymore, just a small paper bag. Sophie noticed her instantly and walked over. "Are you here for the class?" Sophie asked. "No, I just wanted to bring some pastries from my friend's shop," Emily said, setting the bag on the table. "And thank you for last night. Seeing you two made me realize I need to change a few things." She stayed for a few minutes, chatting with people, then left. When the door closed, Sophie looked at me. "I'm guessing she's my former sister-in-law," I said. "But today, she's just someone dropping off pastries." When the class wrapped up, everyone went home with a box of warm, golden biscuits. I returned to my shop and found Karen waiting at the door. "I brought you this," she said, handing me a poster. "Student showcase. At Linda's store. This Saturday." "So it's official?" I asked. "It's official," Karen smiled. Everyone wanted to display their work here because the light is kinder. That afternoon, more customers wandered in than usual. Some asked about the showcase. Others picked up linens for gifts. I realized the haven and my store were starting to feel like two streams flowing side by side, feeding each other. Near closing time, the landline rang. A man's voice introduced himself as an attorney. "You've received some documents from Emily Harrington?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. He went on, "We'd like to invite you in for a conversation. There are financial matters that need clarity, and the truth you hold may protect not only you but others as well." I hung up and stood still. The sunset streamed through the shop window, glinting off the drawer where the envelope sat. I opened it, touched the edge of the paper inside. My heart beat slowly but firmly. Maybe I would read it. Maybe I'd decide something different. But one thing I knew for sure this time: I would not stay silent out of fear. That night, I took home the biscuits Sophie had sent. Biting into the first one, I realized the flavor was more than butter and flour. It was the taste of a life slowly reclaiming its voice. The morning light spilled through my kitchen window, catching in the steam of my coffee. I had barely slept, my mind circling around the envelope lying on the counter like it had a heartbeat of its own. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was a door. Once I opened it, there would be no going back. I sat at the table for a long time, tracing the rim of my mug. My old habit was to push moments like this away, to tell myself, "It can wait. Maybe it's nothing." But the attorney's voice from yesterday wouldn't leave me. "The truth you hold may protect not only you, but others as well." I thought about that others part. Who were they? People Emily had wronged? People who didn't even know they were in danger? Finally, I slid my thumb under the flap and broke the seal. Inside were 3 neatly folded documents: a bank statement, a property record, and what looked like a handwritten agreement. The bank statement showed large transfers, not from Emily, but to her, coming from accounts under names I didn't recognize. The property record listed a house in James Island, a house Emily had claimed she was renting in her name, bought outright in cash only months before. The handwritten note chilled me. It was in my late brother's handwriting, dated shortly before he died. "Emily, the house is yours, as we discussed. But do not, under any circumstances, let Linda know. She has been through enough. She deserves peace." I stared at that line, my throat tightening. He had trusted her to keep something from me. I wasn't sure if it was betrayal or protection, but my gut told me it was complicated, and complicated things, when hidden, usually grow teeth. I folded everything back into the envelope and tucked it into my tote bag. Not the drawer. Not hidden. I would take it with me to the showcase today, like a talisman reminding me that silence was a choice I didn't have to make anymore. The store was already alive when I arrived. Karen was stringing twinkle lights along the front windows, her ladder wobbling slightly until I rushed over to steady it. "You're early," she said, smiling. "Nervous?" "Maybe a little," I admitted. "This is the first time we've ever hosted something like this." The long table from the Haven had been moved to the center of the shop, covered in white linen and sprinkled with wildflowers from a nearby farm. Framed sketches leaned against jars of paintbrushes, and small sculptures sat on wood slices like centerpieces. The smell of cinnamon rolls, courtesy of Sophie and June, made the whole place feel like a kitchen as much as a gallery. By 10 o'clock, people started trickling in. Some were regulars who came to browse, others were family and friends of the artists. The first to arrive was Miss Marie, clutching a canvas of soft blue waves she'd painted from memory of her honeymoon 50 years ago. She set it down like she was placing a baby in a cradle. "This one's not for sale," she whispered to me, but I wanted people to see it. Just once. A few minutes later, the bell over the door jingled again, and Emily walked in. My stomach tightened, but I reminded myself, not everything had to be a confrontation. She carried a small bouquet of yellow tulips and set them on the table without saying much. "Looks beautiful in here," she said softly, her eyes scanning the artwork. He would have loved this. I didn't ask who she meant. I didn't need to. As the morning unfolded, the shop filled with voices and laughter. People leaned close to study brushstrokes, shared memories of the moments that inspired them. A young man stood proudly beside a sculpture made from driftwood he'd collected along Folly Beach, explaining to anyone who'd listen how each piece had a life before it came to me. In the middle of the bustle, the attorney I'd spoken with stepped through the door. He was tall, in his late 50s, with kind but serious eyes. "Miss Harper?" he asked quietly. I nodded, and we stepped to a quieter corner of the shop. "I won't keep you long," he said. "But I've been reviewing other cases tied to Emily Harrington, and what you have could help bring closure to several people. She's been moving funds and property in a pattern we've seen before, always just under the radar." I glanced toward Emily, who was laughing with Karen by the pastry table. My chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't just anger. It was grief for the brother I'd lost, for the trust that had been misplaced, for the years I'd avoided looking too closely. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Copies of those documents, and a statement about how you received them. We can arrange a meeting when you're ready." I promised I'd be in touch, and he left as quietly as he'd come. By late afternoon, the showcase was winding down. Miss Marie's painting had been the star, drawing people to stand in front of it for long, quiet moments. The young man's driftwood sculpture had sold to a local cafe, and Karen, who had been nervous about showing her work, sold 2 of her watercolor prints to tourists who said they wanted a piece of Charleston to take home. When the last guest left, Karen and I sat at the table, surrounded by crumbs and empty coffee cups. "You realize this has to be an annual thing, right?" she said, grinning. "I think it does," I agreed. Before we packed up, I noticed Emily had left the tulips in a vase near the window. Tucked under the vase was a folded note. "Linda, there are things I can't undo, and maybe you'll never forgive me, but you deserve to know the truth, all of it. If you're willing, meet me at the old pier tomorrow at 6. I'll tell you everything." I held the note for a long time. Part of me wanted to crumple it, to protect the thin layer of peace I'd been building. But another part, the part that had finally opened the envelope this morning, knew that peace built on avoidance wasn't peace at all. That night, I sat on my porch with the tulips beside me, their yellow petals glowing in the lamplight. The river breeze carried the faint sound of music from somewhere down the street. I thought about the haven, about the store, about the people who had gathered today. I thought about the attorney's words, "Protect not only you, but others as well." And I thought about Emily, standing in my shop like she belonged and yet somehow entirely apart. Tomorrow, I would go to the pier. Not because I trusted her, not because I needed her approval, but because the truth, even when it hurt, was better than the slow suffocation of not knowing. And this time, I would not leave empty-handed. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with me. The pier at sunset looks like a sentence that knows where it is going. The planks run straight toward the horizon, the rails keep a clean line, and the water says the same word over and over until even your heartbeat starts to answer. I got there a few minutes early, because old habits die loud. When you have spent years bracing, you learn to arrive before the blow. Emily was already waiting, hands in the pockets of a camel coat, hair tugged loose by the wind. She looked smaller, without a room to arrange around herself. Out here there is no brand voice, no conference table. There is only the truth and whether you can stand it. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I almost didn't," I answered. Honesty had gotten me this far. I wasn't setting it down now. She nodded like she respected that. "May we walk?" We moved to the right side where the pilings creak and the river widens. Gulls argued overhead, then thought better of it and let the wind do their talking. For a while, we just listened to our shoes and the water. "What you gave me," I said finally, "it is a map. Not the whole territory, but enough to keep a person from getting lost. Emails from the accountant, ledger screenshots, wire confirmations. Names I do not know, names I wish I did not have to." Emily's mouth pressed flat. "It is more than a year of trying to stop something I did not build and could not carry. I kept telling myself, if I gather enough, my father will act. If I am careful enough, Ethan will realize there is no way out that does not end in a wall. But our family treats consequences like weather. If you stay inside long enough, you can pretend it did not happen." "And the property record?" I asked. "The James Island house. An asset parked in a company 2 steps from Clark Holdings," she said. "Not mine. It is a pattern. He hides things in other people's names, then insists they owed him the favor." She looked at me hard. I did not take money from your daughter's store, Mrs. Moore. I knew about it. I tried to stop it. And that, I suppose, makes me guilty in a slower way. The wind lifted the edge of her scarf. She let it flap. People who are done with pretending stop tucking loose ends. My father called last night, she went on. He thinks if we can get you to sign something, all of this will stay where he can manage it. He believes management is mercy. I believed it too once. I said no. I told her. I know, she said. I was there. In the street. I could see you through the window, taking down lights after the student showcase. You looked tired, not afraid. She took a breath. That is why I asked you to meet me. I want you to have everything. I want you to use it. I am finished being a soft landing for men who jump without looking. We stopped at the end of the pier. The boards there are newer, a shade lighter than the rest. Repairs happen. If you live long enough, you can see them. What happens if I hand this over? I asked. Not to a private attorney who wants a tidy settlement, to actual law, to people who do not get invited to golf. Her smile was quick and humorless. Then some very expensive suits will sweat. Some phone calls will get short. Some men will discover their last names cannot hold a dam against the wrong river. It will not be quick. It will not be clean. But it will be true. And you? I said. What happens to you? I do not know, she said. My father will not thank me. My brother will call me a traitor. Some people will clap when I pass because they think courage is contagious. Others will cross the street because they are afraid it is. I will sleep better. We let that settle. It did not get lighter, but it got familiar. I will not be cruel, I said. That is not the point. The point is accountability and protection. Staff. Vendors. The kids who took classes in that shop and think business means the person with the biggest voice wins. I want restitution where there is loss. I want letters of apology with signatures that do not smudge. I want quiet promises turned into loud policies, so nobody ever calls a mother a street vendor again and gets a check for the insult. You will have allies, she said. More than you think. There are women in my family who have been waiting a long time for a door to open that is not a back exit. I thought of Sophie in her apron, laughing with June, teaching a stranger how to fold parchment so it makes a cradle for dough. There are 1,000 small doors in a life. If you learn to open them, the big ones stop scaring you. Tomorrow, I said, I will call the attorney. I will have copies made. I will give statements. But I will not sign a gag. I am done renting my silence. Good, Emily said. If anyone offers you a deal again, ask yourself who it protects. If the answer is not the people who got hurt, it is not a deal. It is a costume. We started back. The sun slid behind a bank of cloud and made a silver road across the water. I have always liked that trick. Light looking for a way through. Halfway to shore, she stopped again. There is one more thing you should know, she said. The accountant who first sent me those emails, she was threatened. Not directly. Her kid's school suddenly had an anonymous donor who wanted records. Her landlord started talking about a rent adjustment that made no sense. I have those notes too. It is a pattern. If you go forward, this will touch you. They will not come at you with fists. They will come at you with favors that curdle. I have known both kinds, I said. I am not afraid of either. I believe you, she said softly. You do not make a life like yours if fear gets the front seat. We reached the start of the pier. Traffic on the road beyond was evening slow, the kind that lets you change lanes without asking a favor. Emily put out her hand. I took it. Her grip was cool and dry. I expect nothing from you, she said. If you do nothing, you will still be kinder than most. If you do something, I will stand where I can without pulling you down. Thank you for telling the truth, I said. The world runs better when more of us do. She left toward the parking lot. I stood a minute longer and let the wind refile my thoughts. Then I went to my car and sat with my hands on the wheel until I could feel them again. On the way home, my phone buzzed with a photo from Sophie. A tray of biscuits on a wire rack, brown and proud. One edge a shade darker where a corner had kissed the pan. Taste test number 2. June says do not eat all of them before you get here. No promises. I sent back. At the townhouse, I put the envelope on the kitchen table instead of tucking it away. I am learning that where you place a thing changes what it is. Hidden, it is a threat. In the open, it is a task. I called Karen. She picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. "She brought me more truth," I said. "And a warning about the kind that wears perfume." Karen made a pleased sound that also held worry. "We will scan everything first thing in the morning. We will schedule the meeting. We will ask for whistleblower protections for the accountant and for anyone else named. I want restitution language for vendors and staff," I said. "And if there is a settlement at any point, it comes with an apology letter so plain even a headline cannot dress it up." "We can ask," she said. "We can require some of it. The rest we can make expensive to avoid." I thanked her and hung up. Then I did the one thing that always puts the ground back under me when the air gets thin. I washed dishes by hand. The sound of water. The feel of a clean plate going upright to dry. Work you can finish in one standing. Later, when the kitchen was quiet, I wrote in my journal. Today on the pier I learned that some doors feel like threats and are actually exits. I also learned that when someone returns a weight that is not theirs, you should not hand it back out of habit. I closed the book and slept hard. Morning brought a kind of clear that feels like it belongs to people who get up early on purpose. I brewed tea, tucked the envelope into my tote, and walked to the shop, letting Charleston wake up around me. The old houses softened their shadows. A dog pulled his human past my door like joy on a leash. Karen arrived with her scanner and a face that said both business and bread. She set a paper bag on the counter. "Scones," she said. "For courage." "We will need them," I said, and we did. We fed the machine page after page. Emails with subject lines that tried to sound boring and failed. Ledger lines that added up to the shape of a theft. Names that slid like oil off paper and still left stains. A note from the accountant warning of a new line of credit secured by inventory that did not exist. A list of vendors paid late, and then pressured to sign new terms with promises instead of interest. By mid-morning, we had a neat stack of copies and a flash drive that held what we could not afford to lose. Karen labeled everything like a woman who has lost things before and never wants to repeat the lesson. We locked the originals in the safe, the copies in a banker's box, and the drive in my pocket. "Meeting at 2, she said. "The attorney, possibly someone from the state's office, and a representative from the board who has recently remembered his fiduciary duty." "I will bring tea," I said. I would like to be the only person in the room with manners. We both laughed, and the laughter took the corners off the hour. A little after noon, Sophie slipped in, cheeks pink from the walk, a paper bag held high like a prize. "Do not be mad," she said. "But I ate one in the car. I brought you the other 5. "That is love," I said, and broke one in half. We stood behind the counter with crumbs on our fingers while I told her, not everything, but enough. That I had met Emily, that I would be turning things over, that there might be noise. "I can handle noise," she said. "I have worked in kitchens, also in boardrooms. The volume is the same. The smell is worse in one of them." "I am sorry it is not simpler," I said. "It is simpler," she answered. "You are choosing the truth. Everything after that is logistics." She kissed my cheek and went back to the hearth table to prep for an evening class. I watched her go and saw not the child I had carried through rain, not the young woman I had once tried too hard to save, but a person with her own hands on her own wheel. It is a relief I do not know how to measure. At 1:45, Karen and I carried the box to her car. The sky had pulled clouds like linen over its face. Charleston looks good in overcast. It lets the past and the present sit closer together without arguing about who is more handsome. The attorney's conference room was all glass and quiet rugs. We set the box on the table like a loaf of bread in a sermon. The attorney shook our hands. A woman from the state's office joined by video, her background a plain wall and a plant that had not given up. The board representative arrived last, breathing a little too fast, tie a little too tight. We began. Karen did the legal spine. I did the story. Not the one with adjectives. The one with dates and signatures and a mother who learned how to speak without asking permission. When we were done, the state's counsel said, "Thank you for bringing this to us before anyone could make it smaller." The board man cleared his throat. "We appreciate your cooperation." "I am not cooperating," I said, polite as a porch. "I am requiring. Vendors get paid, staff get protected. If there is an apology, it is signed and sent, not posted. If anyone tries to bargain with my silence again, they will meet it in a courtroom instead." He swallowed. "Understood." When we left, the air outside felt like a long breath. Karen put her hand on my shoulder in that brief, old friend way that says more than speeches. "You did well," she said. "I did necessary," I answered. Back at the shop, the light through the window made patterns on the floor like a quilt. A customer picked up a mug and said, "This handle feels like it was made for my hand." I told her it was, in a way. The potter made dozens, and then kept the ones that taught her something about comfort. The woman smiled like she had been invited to a secret that was not a secret at all. That evening, Sophie sent a photo of the class. Flour on her apron, joy on her face. "We burned only 2 edges," she wrote. "Progress measured in inches is still progress." "Always," I replied. I locked the shop and stood a minute on the sidewalk. The day had been full of hard things and soft things, and somehow they had learned to sit together without making a mess. Tomorrow would bring emails and headlines and opinions I did not ask for. It would bring customers and kids and probably a delivery that arrived with the wrong size boxes. I would handle all of it in the order it came. On the walk home, I passed a little boy on a scooter and his grandmother taking very careful small steps so she could keep up. He called back to her, not looking, certain she was there. That certainty is a kind of wealth I wish on every child. It is not bought with checks. It is built with days like this. At home, I set the flash drive in the ceramic dish by my keys. I poured tea. I opened my journal and wrote one line and then another. Today, I did not trade peace for quiet. They are not the same thing. Tomorrow we would keep going. And after tomorrow, too. The table was long enough. The light was kind enough. And my voice, at last, was strong enough to carry its own name. The morning of the showcase arrived draped in the soft gold of early spring. I unlocked the shop just after dawn, the scent of fresh polish and lavender drifting from the shelves. Karen and a few volunteers bustled in carrying boxes of student work hand-woven baskets, watercolor landscapes, pottery with glazes that shimmered like sea glass. We set everything out on the long wooden tables, each piece with a little card bearing the artist's name. The room began to hum with quiet pride. By noon, neighbors and curious passers-by had filled the space, leaning in to admire the brushstrokes, the weave of the straw, the delicate beadwork. Sophie arrived with a tray of lemon bars, her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk over. "You should see the haven," she said. "We had to bring in extra chairs." I smiled, feeling a swell of something I hadn't known in years, a sense that what I was building was part of something larger than myself. Just as I was greeting an older couple near the pottery display, the bell above the door jingled. Emily stepped inside. She carried the same paper bag I'd seen before, but this time she didn't linger by the door. She walked straight to me. "I read your note," she said quietly, so only I could hear. "And I think you're right. I need to face what's been happening." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "I have a folder for you. It's not everything yet, but it's enough to start." I nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting, just holding the moment. "Thank you for coming." She left as quickly as she'd arrived, but I could feel the ripple of her visit through me. Sophie must have seen something in my face because she came over. "Do I need to ask?" she said. "No," I replied. "But maybe soon I'll tell you." The day wound on in a swirl of conversations and warm handshakes. People bought baskets and paintings, not out of charity, but because they genuinely loved the work. When the last customer left and the tables were cleared, the shop felt different, as if the walls themselves had soaked in all that connection. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Emily's envelope. The seal was already broken. Inside were a few printed emails and 2 handwritten notes enough to confirm that the polite distance I'd been offered all these years wasn't an accident. It was engineered. I read them once, then again, my hands perfectly steady. The words were as plain as they were cruel, but they didn't pierce me the way they might have before. Maybe because I had built something in the meantime, a life, a place, a circle of people who saw me as more than a burden or a bargaining chip. The phone rang. It was the attorney again. "If you're ready," he said, "we can meet Monday. You have more power here than you realize. I glanced toward the window. Outside, the street lamps cast halos on the quiet pavement. I'm not sure about power, I told him, but I'm ready for the truth. After I hung up, I took another bite of Sophie's lemon bar and let the tartness linger. I thought about the way life sometimes hands you a second chance, not to rewrite the past, but to step into the present without flinching. Whatever Monday brought, I knew one thing. I wouldn't be walking into that room as the same woman who once stayed silent to keep the peace. I'd be walking in as the woman who had learned, slowly and stubbornly, that peace built on fear isn't peace at all. Monday came with the kind of calm sky that makes you believe in second chances. I walked into the attorney's office without rushing, without rehearsing what to say. My folder was in my bag, but so was something else, the steady awareness that I wasn't here to fight for revenge. I was here to stand in my own truth. Emily was already in the conference room when I arrived. She looked different from the last time I saw her, less guarded, almost hopeful. She gave a small nod, and I returned it. No theatrics, no grand reunion, just two people meeting where they were. The conversation that followed was not easy. We reviewed the documents, spoke about the years of distance, and named the choices that had carved those gaps. There were moments when my voice caught, moments when hers did too. But somewhere between the accusations we didn't throw and the apologies we didn't force, I felt the sharp edges begin to dull. I'm not here to erase what happened, I told her, but I'm not carrying it any further than today. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't expect you to forget. I won't, I said gently. But I can forgive, for my sake, as much as yours. It wasn't a cinematic reconciliation. There was no tight embrace under a swelling soundtrack. Instead, we agreed on what boundaries would look like moving forward, and we shook hands. It sounds formal, but in that moment, it was the most honest thing we could manage. When I stepped back outside, the sun felt warmer. The air was laced with the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. And I thought about her story, not just mine, but every woman I've met in the Haven who has carried her own wounds into a room and dared to put them down. Forgiveness, I realized, is less about the person you forgive and more about making room for yourself to breathe again. That evening, the Haven was filled with its usual Monday night buzz. Karen was setting up for the knitting circle. Sophie was arranging teacups, and a few newcomers were introducing themselves shyly at the door. I moved among them with ease, listening to their small triumphs and quiet struggles. I didn't tell them about my meeting that morning. It wasn't secrecy. It was simply that the day's lesson had already found its place in me. What mattered now was keeping this place alive for everyone who needed it. Later, when the last of the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, I sat for a moment in the quiet. I thought about how far I'd come from that day at the wedding, the day I felt my love being weighed against a price tag. If I could speak to that version of myself now, I would tell her this: you will survive this, and you will become someone you're proud of. To those of you listening tonight, maybe your own her story feels heavy right now. Maybe you're carrying the sting of family betrayal, or the ache of words that can't be taken back. I can't tell you exactly how your ending will look, but I can tell you this: you have more say in it than you think. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It means deciding that the harm will not write the final chapter for you. It means choosing peace over bitterness, not because they deserve it, but because you do. If this story has touched something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own her story in the comments, the moments you've found your strength, the ways you've chosen to move forward. And if you believe in stories that remind us of dignity, love, and second chances, please like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because somewhere out there, another person is waiting to hear that it's not too late to stand tall again. And maybe your story will be the one to help them believe it.